next day, all the Montfort brothers resigned. They're just taken right out of there. And the Oblates come in to replace them. So there was something very odd going on, and a number of the children died, and I found the death records and everything. So there was that kind of stuff going on.
Well, did the tribunal ask for proof, written proof, or did they accept the oral proof?
Well, they had both. They had the oral proof, and they also had some corroborating proof that this stuff was going on. They also subpoenaed the government and the churches and the RCMP to come and answer questions, because ultimately they're the ones with the evidence, the documentation of this. And every single one of them, from Jean Chrétien right on down, they just refused to come. They never answered or anything. But, other things were described, the sterilization hospitals. Women showed up who described being sterilized simply because they were Indians and wouldn't go to church.
I couldn't have any more children after Dr. Darby got to me. He made an announcement in our village that anyone who wasn't in church on Sunday had to report to him for a special procedure. I never went to his United Church since they did so much harm. But Darby was missionary, so his word was law. So the Mounties came and got me and brought me to Darby. He gave me a shot. Next thing I knew, I was in bed, all bruised and hurting. I was missing all my gold teeth. Something didn't feel right inside me. I never could conceive after that. Later, another doctor told me I'd been sterilized. George Darby, he did that to hundreds of our women.
As part of the eugenics movement that swept the world after the 1920s, laws to allow the sterilization of Aboriginal men, women, and children were passed across Canada under pressure from both Catholic and Protestant churches, in Alberta in 1928 and in British Columbia in 1933. Missionary doctors of the Anglican, Catholic, and United Church of Canada sterilized thousands of Native people in hospitals all over Canada, as part of the campaign to depopulate Aboriginal land to allow its occupation by European settlers and corporations. The main targets of the sterilization program were the traditional leaders of the Aboriginal nations, the tribal chieftains and their families, who were slated for extermination. Accordingly, the sterilization campaign against traditional families has continued to the present day. Dr. James Goodbrand sterilized many of our women. In 1952, when he heard I was going to marry a traditional chief, Goodbrand kept saying to me, "If you marry Freddie, I'll have to do an operation on you." That scared me, and I tried to see another doctor, but the Indian agent wouldn't let me. So when I gave birth to my daughter, it was Goodbrand who delivered her. After the birth, I hurt really bad and I kept bleeding. Then I learned that my tubes had been tied. He must have done it to me after the delivery when I was still unconscious. I heard Goodbrand say he was getting paid $300 by the government for every Indian woman he sterilized.
Were there any white people that gave testimony as to this happening?
There was a couple of staff members from the Alberta School who gave testimony, Caucasian staff members, and they confirmed everything and more than what the people were saying.
So what was the results? What did the tribunal do?
Well, the result of the tribunal was they sent a report to the United Nations to Mary Robinson, was High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva at the UN office there. And they sent a report to her. I sent 14 hours of videotape plus all of the documentation and affidavits and everything to her office. We never heard a thing. Never got back to us. And a couple of years later, I learned that it was because of pressure that Canada brought to bear at the UN to keep this issue under the wraps, basically.
How could Canada do that? You mean Canada can influence the United Nations?
Well, it has a lot of pull. For example, at the time, the General Secretary's assistant was a woman, Denise Frechette, who was a career civil servant from the Department of National Defense in Ottawa, and she was the one at the UN setting the agenda of all these different divisions and committees at the UN. So it would have been easy for her and others to keep this off the agenda.
As an arm of the Canadian government, The United Church of Canada has led this attack against Kevin Annett and his work, with the active support of covert operatives of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Cooperation between the RCMP and United Church in this silencing campaign against Kevin Annett began as early as June 4, 1996, when church official John Siebert wrote to Sergeant Paul Wilms of the RCMP's E Division in Vancouver to share confidential information about Kevin, after he had spoken out in the media about the deaths of children in United Church Indian residential schools. That same month, Sergeant Wilms used this information to confront and threaten Kevin if he did not stop making public allegations of murders in residential schools. When Kevin refused to stop investigating residential school crimes, this joint harassment campaign against him by the United Church and the RCMP intensified. Between 1997 and 1998, church officials sabotaged Kevin's doctoral program of studies at the University of British Columbia by blocking funding for him, which forced Kevin to withdraw from the program. One of Kevin's professors admits having been spoken to by RCMP officers about what they called the dangerous nature of Kevin's research into United Church residential schools. Yet by far the most serious attacks on Kevin Annett and his supporters came in the wake of the historic tribunal into residential schools that Kevin organized in June of 1998 in Vancouver. His success in bringing United Nations observers to this event to hear residential school survivors' testimonies caused the government to directly subvert and destroy Kevin's work.
Naturally, it was sabotage. And when you get big enough, it's kind of like being a germ in a system. You get big enough and the antibodies attack you, and that's what happened. It was clear from the tribunal that a lot of crimes that had never been heard about were finally out there publicly. People talked about sterilizations for the first time, the medical experiments that they were doing on kids at the Catholic and United Church hospitals and the residential schools on the West Coast. That was all talked about. We sent it off to the United Nations, and in retaliation, a lot of shit came down on the people who did it. I mean, Harry Nahani, who was the person who identified that the little girl had been killed, murdered at the residential school, United Church, when she was a witness to it. The RCMP broke into her house without a warrant 2 weeks after the tribunal. The RCMP tactical squad ransacked the house at gunpoint, held everybody at gunpoint, and just ransacked the house. People were threatened. They were thrown out of their jobs on the reserve after they'd given testimonies. I started getting followed around by these two guys who physically attacked me on 2 occasions. This was all within a month or two of the tribunal, so the heat began to come down. And I knew it is because things that were shared at the tribunal weren't just about the past. They were about pedophile rings that were being operated today with the help of native politicians and church lawyers. It was about crimes of the present that were begun in the past but carried on today in the Aboriginal world. It all began to, the veil began to lift for me. I realized I've got a real tiger by the tail here. It isn't just about something that happened years ago, because if it was, why would the harassment continue? I mean, the stuff in the past has been resolved. They've bought off the witnesses. They've paid off people with court settlements.
So why did they continue then?
They continued the harassment because this is about stuff today. This is about how Native people are still being exploited, how Native children are still being used, how land is still being stolen by multinational corporations, and how the Native politicians are important to this whole thing. And so they don't want the truth of the residential schools brought up because they themselves are implicated in these crimes. When they were kids, they were the enforcers. They were the ones who helped abuse and control their fellow students. So they don't want that coming out. And I began to learn that after the tribunal. And like I say, the proof was in the pudding. We were shut down. The results of the tribunal were never acted on by the UN. The media imposed a blackout on the whole issue. I was completely isolated. In the year after the tribunal, it felt like a wall was falling down around me.
But was it?
Yes, these cage doors were just closing on me, bang, bang, bang. The media wouldn't talk to me anymore. My letters weren't printed. People stopped talking to me. The Native chiefs wouldn't have anything to do with me. It was just absolute shutdown on every front.
So why did you continue?
Well, I didn't really want to at first. It felt like this is pointless. I'm up against the state. I'm up against the church, multinationals, their Native accomplices. I mean, who the hell is going to support me? The Natives don't want to because they're too scared for their life. The whites don't want to because they see me as a traitor. So I didn't feel I could proceed. But there was something, my mind was telling me that, but there was something inside me that was very stubborn and said, you have to keep going.
In the years following the Residential Schools Tribunal, Kevin Annett persisted in his efforts to document and make public the evidence of mass murder and ethnic cleansing in Canada. Abandoned, penniless, and attacked from all sides, Kevin nevertheless continued to speak out publicly on the hidden history of mass murder in Canada, and kept on documenting all that he had been told and had discovered about crimes against Native people. But Kevin's crowning achievement came in early 2001, when he finally published the accumulated testimonies and documents about atrocities in Canadian Indian residential schools in a book entitled Hidden from History: The Canadian Holocaust. A dozen separate publishers refused to produce the book, so Kevin printed it himself and circulated more than 1,000 copies to libraries, governments, human rights groups, and Aboriginal people around the world. But most of the books ended up in the hands of the people for whom Kevin had labored so long, the residential school survivors themselves. In the fall of 2005, Kevin completed the much expanded second edition of Hidden from History, and for the first time asked the deeper question of why legal genocide had happened in his country, what had given rise to this plague in the first place, and why is it continuing?
Kevin, you've remarked to me that the tides are changing, that things slowly are becoming made known. Yes, they are. It is very slow. Remember, it was 10 years ago that hearing took place. But I do believe that the changes that have come about are because of the price you have paid. A terrible price of what you have paid.
I think his work has been serving a really valuable purpose by bringing, first and foremostly, these issues to light. And I know Kevin's had to endure a lot of suffering and a lot of loss, particularly in his work, his livelihood, his being defrocked and losing his congregation, and subsequent attacks by the church, police positions and powers of authority. And a lot of the Native people that Kevin has worked with in the past as well have suffered attacks, people having their automobiles tampered with, putting their lives in jeopardy, being attacked and under constant surveillance by hostile occupational forces such as the RCMP.
Let's fire Kevin Annett. If he doesn't have a job, he doesn't do the work he does in the community, and that's exactly what happened. And as anyone knows who was involved at that time, we tried desperately to convince the United Church not to fire Kevin Annett because he was doing a lot of good work. But of course our pleas fell on deaf ears because those people didn't live in the community, they didn't witness the good work Kevin did, and the end result is their legacy of corruption continues.
Church officials have repeatedly silenced journalists and prevented publications from reporting the facts of both crimes in Indian residential schools and Kevin Annett's expulsion from the church. In January of 1999, the globally acclaimed magazine The New Internationalist ran a brief article on Kevin Annett and genocide in Canada. In response, National United Church official David Iverson circulated a 14-page character assassination of Kevin Annett to the world media, and threatened the New Internationalist with a boycott of their magazine unless it stopped all reporting of residential school crimes and Kevin Annett. New Internationalist editors buckled to this pressure and never again reported Kevin Annett's work. In March of 1999, the national magazine Canadian Dimension was similarly silenced after it ran an article by Kevin Annett on the Ahousaht land deal between the United Church and Macmillan Bloedel. United Church lawyers threatened Canadian Dimension with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit unless it publicly retracted the article, which it did. In September of 1997, the Vancouver Courier newspaper ran a front-page article on Kevin Annett that went into detail about Kevin's uncovering of land theft and other crimes by the church on Vancouver Island. United Church official Phil Spencer, who had helped arrange Kevin's dismissal from the church, tried to force a retraction by the newspaper and have the article's author, Clodagh O'Connell, fired. When this failed, Spencer went so far as to verbally harass Ms. O'Connell at her home.
I felt I had to call what I thought was the church back to its real soul, which had been lost.
And you felt you could?
Not by myself, but I felt I had to do that. I had to try.
Did it work?
Sure, it worked. Why do you think all the shit has happened? It's because it worked. After, losing my wife and kids, and trying to re-educate, trying to get a PhD, and then having that blocked, being unable to support myself, having to save my dimes and nickels every week to have enough money to go on the bus to see my kids for 2 hours, having to eat off plates in the university, other people's food, so I wouldn't have to buy dinner, so I'd have enough bus fare to see my kids. That made me feel like I was on the bottom, and that there was no one around to help me. Not even family. They just stood right back and said, well, this man should pull himself up by his own bootstraps. They didn't realize that there were all these forces in the world that were trying to keep me down that way, that the United Church did not want that PhD produced, that the RCMP did not want that tribunal done, and they
But the
tried
more
to
they
stop
tried,
it.
what did that do to you? The more they tried.
I got angry at them. I said, why? What the hell right do they have to do that to me? What the hell have I done wrong? Nothing. I said...
Did you lose your faith in
No,
the
here's the wrong I did. The wrong I did was I expected the church to live by its principles. That was my wrong.
What were its principles?
It claimed to be following the footsteps of Jesus Christ. To seek truth. They have this great statement in the United Church to walk humbly and seek justice, in the world. Well, I just expected them to do that. That's what it said on paper. I just asked them to live by their principles when it had to do with land they had stolen from the native people and children that they had hurt and murdered in the residential school. I simply said, do what's right. And I was told time and again that it was wrong for me to have done that.
You knew that it happened before. You were well read.
Yeah.
You realized that the last 200 years, 2,000 years, that happened.
Yeah, but I was complicit in it. I was part of the culture that did it, and I was blind to it. Raised in that condition of affluence, I had an idea. I remember thinking when I was in my 20s, oh yeah, native people, yeah, they've been put down. I had kind of a vague idea that they were on the outs and they had been attacked and murdered en masse and all that, but it didn't enter my life at all. I mean, it didn't really... The only contact I'd ever had with native people was when I was 15. We went up to a village in northern BC on an exchange, and we lived for 10 days among Aboriginal kids up there, and then they came down into our community and hung out with us. But what I saw just blew my mind in that little community of Hazelton in northern BC. Just unbelievable. I didn't think people lived like that in Canada.
Did worse than you did.
Well, I mean, yeah, even the poorest white person, they didn't come anywhere near the experience of what was going on in that village. Kids running around, I mean, not just literally without clothes and dying from malnutrition, but I mean, there'd be like, there was a little 6-year-old girl whose dad had gone after with an axe. She was carrying a mark around on her head because her dad had whacked at her while she was drunk. And that was just accepted. Like, I mean, oh yeah, well... It wasn't considered there was anything wrong with that. And I thought, well, these people, I think I was scared by that. I thought, and so when I got older, I thought, well, native people are kind of an oddity. I don't really want to understand them too much. I mean, that was all going on in me. But then I realized I had to. The more I began to work with them, I had to understand.
And what did you come to understand?
Well, it didn't come right away. It came over time.
What came?
What genocide really looks like, up close. What it means to be at the receiving end of a campaign to exterminate you. What it means to be the survivors of mass murder. You go around you feel like you're going to die at any moment. You're going to be tortured at any moment again. So all you have to do is hide. You got to hide.
You could identify with that?
Oh yeah.
I still have nightmares about snakes and all the kind of things that happened to me in school, and very difficult, Sometimes I tried ending my life many times because I just couldn't stand the pain that I was going through.
It took each of us in there one by one. And he had us bend over and had Vaseline with him. He did that to each of us 3 times, I remember that. To satisfy himself. to enjoy himself on little kids. I forgot how old I was, either 6, 7, or 8, maybe 9, I forget. But I remember, I'll never forget Mr. Moore.
He said, "You know what, sis?" He says, "I can't wait to get out of this hellhole. I'm going to tell everything." And then the phone went dead. People at Cooper Island always listened to our phone calls and censored our letters back, coming in and going out. So I was afraid for him, but I didn't think it was going to be as bad as it was. It turned out as bad as it was. 2 days later, we got a phone call saying that he hung himself. He committed suicide. But I'd never, ever believed in my heart that he'd ever do that. They had them walk through the gym while Richard was still hanging and told them that it could happen to them.
My brother died because of a cattle prod, of a shock of a cattle prod. When he was 4 years old, they dragged him by the hair and they cut his skin right off his head. The pastors did that with a whip, like a horse whip. It was sharp, with these little blades on it. And when I was in there, I heard him scream for help. And right away, there was a lot of blood on the floor, and they wouldn't take him to a hospital or the nurse or nothing. What happened then? When I was in there, I heard him still scream for help. "Rick, help! They're torturing me. I'm gonna die." So he died right away, like that. He was my only best friend and my only brother that I always loved.
What would be the final solution for you? What would relieve your mind or give you calm?
Well, when you're dealing with a crime this huge, there isn't any solution ultimately, because it's not as if something like this can be healed. It's like when you look at genocide being perpetrated on one group of people, it never stays confined to that one group. It always blows back on the people perpetrating it. And I often think about that when I look at what we're doing to the land and the environment. I mean, we destroyed people who had been living in harmony with the land for thousands, tens of thousands of years. And that can't help but affect us and the way that we live. But I think that something this huge, you can't just give an apology and a bit of money. It's an insult to people who have been sterilized and seen their friends murdered to think that that's going to solve anything. But what will begin to turn the tables on this is if the perpetrators are brought to justice and are able to say, yes, we did these crimes, yes, we did try to wipe you out. I often know, working with Native people who've been through these death camps called residential schools, for them, they never talk about money, they never talk about compensation. A lot of the Native politicians will talk about that. But the people on the ground, they keep saying over and over, I just want to face the people who did this to me. I want to tell them what I think about them, and I want them to admit what they did to me in front of the world.
I think if they did that, I would forgive them if they would just admit what they did to us is genocide.
And the government has never ever came up and acknowledged their mistake of a residential school. And to me that's totally wrong. And the churches are hiding behind the laws of man-made laws and not admitting their wrongs regarding residential school. And I feel that's cowardly.
They're thinking they figured they could get away with it?
Oh yeah, of course
Why
they
did
could
they
get
figure
away
they
with
could
it.
get away with
Because they were the law. The church and the government were and still are the law. Churches are exempt from prosecution for these things, clearly. For almost 10 years, the knowledge of these things have been out in the press. The courts have refused to prosecute the churches over these crimes. Time and again, judges have said this issue of genocide is not going to be addressed in this court. They restricted it to issues like, well, the children suffered a loss in education, or they were hit sometimes, but they've refused systematically to address the issue of murder and genocide. We know that in just the residential schools, the official death rate given by the government themselves was 50%. And if they took they claim 100,000 children went through the schools, but that's conservative because they would often grab children in whole areas, not just the 7-year-olds and up, which they had to do under the law, but 3, 4, 5-year-old kids were common in the residential schools. So if you double their number, you're probably talking 250,000 children went through the residential schools. Half of them who died, 100,000 children alone just in the residential schools. When you look at the whole history of the Indian reserves, and it's got to be in the millions.
If they want evidence, as a 7-year-old child, I witnessed myself the burial of a child, and I didn't know what was happening at that time. I was with another student, and I asked him, I said, "What's happening here? I see them digging a hole in the orchard," and they said they're burying another one.
In '65, there's a bunch of us kids playing soccer in the back field. There was a brush of leaves and grass piled up, and there was a body underneath it. One of the kids kicked the ball, and he went to get it. It was quite decomposed.
Went to Waterbury in 1960, and I found a dead body in 1967 in between Ross Hall and Colwell Hall. Native girl, she was about 16, and I told Jay Andrews, and Jay Andrews shipped me out of Waterbury, went to Nanaimo, and I believe it was a cover-up.
And we need those children returned home. They need to be brought back and given a proper burial. And that's really kind of a most basic first thing that the churches and government need to do. They need to identify where those bodies are.
And I remember we used to go dig graves there. And they would be kids that came from Charles Camsell Indian Hospital. How they died, I don't know. But I know we just dug a lot of graves.
There was a lot of Eskimo babies buried in that burial ground, which was behind the principal's house. Just on the other side of the staff garden. There was 4 of us that dug the grave. Myself, my brother Larry, Mel Patsy, and Albert Cardinal.
When my mom was younger, her and a friend were instructed to go throw away this thing that was wrapped in a newspaper, and they were told not to look into it. But they didn't listen. They unwrapped it, and it was a fetus.
One particular incident was where a nun sexually abused, sexually abused a young boy, and as a result, the nun became pregnant and gave birth to a baby. And after it gave birth to the baby, this was one incident that they killed the baby, and they had the young fella dig a grave for the baby. Another incident was a lady witnessed a nun in Cranbrook where they gave a baby and had her participate in drowning the baby in the bucket of water, And now it's become a cornerstone of some building in Cranbrook.
I would say that one of the biggest things that we're asking for right now is that where are those children buried, and how can we get them home? Is there any difference between what happened with Nazi Germany and what's happened over here?
The key now is to get a lot of the stories and the documentation out into the mainstream through these kinds of documentaries, and just keeping the international pressure in Canada. I think, for example, organizing an international boycott of Canadian goods, maybe a boycott of the 2010 Olympics, something like that. That's the kind of thing that's going to bring international pressure on Canada. I think that's the only way this stuff is ever going to come out, because the contradiction here is that the very institutions that committed these crimes are still in power. They're all legitimate, they're protected by the law, the government, the churches, the RCMP. These are mainstream institutions, and they're not going to prosecute themselves over this. They're going to have to be brought to some kind of international court of justice.
Is there one human that could be responsible for that, could be taken to court?
Yeah, any of the the fiduciary officers of these organizations, the Prime Minister of Canada, the heads of the United Church, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the superintendent of the RCMP, they're all just as culpable under the Nuremberg laws. Those precedents that say heads of state are just as liable for the actions of murder as are the soldiers who pull the trigger. Well, it isn't just the people in the residential schools that are liable for this, but these officials in the churches and government, which is probably why they've put so much energy into denying this stuff, smearing and assassinating the character of people like me who are trying to bring out the truth about this, and intimidating Native eyewitnesses, using their own chiefs often to do that.
Who's going to listen? Who's going to stand up? In a court case in this country of ours, minimum we need is $80,000 to $800,000 to start a court case. And how many lawyers in this country of ours that's going to stand up and fight for our just rights? There ain't any. How many Indian lawyers we got have yet seen one to step up to the plate to take the fight all the way? Oh, I hate doing this.